Good afternoon, and welcome to yet another extremely topical and extremely timely AMET webinar. As most of us in the audience are very well aware, from reading the reports in the Wall Street Journal, at least 12 UNRWA employees were directly involved in the barbaric and sadistic massacres of October 7th. This includes 2 teachers and a school guidance counselor. And according to Helen Neuer of UN Watch, at least 3,000 UNRWA employees have ties to Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Or as a senior government official who was quoted in the Wall Street Journal article said, quote, UNRWA's problem is not just a few bad apples. The institution as a whole is haven for Hamas's radical ideology. As most of you are also aware, the United States, which is the largest funder of UNRWA at the tune of $343.9 million a year, and over the past 3 years has given over $1 billion, has recently suspended further aid to UNRWA. This has been followed by 16 other nations plus the EU, including Germany, Sweden, Japan, France, Switzerland, Canada, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Australia, Italy, Austria, Finland, New Zealand, Iceland, Romania, and Estonia. UNRWA, however, is not the only UN agency or NGO that hides behind its humanitarian smokescreen, collecting billions of dollars from the international community while it is complicit in aiding and abetting terrorist organizations. That is why we are tremendously honored to have with us today Professor Gerald Steinberg, the Director of NGO Monitor, to discuss this in detail. Professor Steinberg is founder and president of NGO Monitor, and he's professor emeritus at Bar-Ilan University, where he founded the program on conflict management and negotiation. His research focuses on the Middle East, on Middle Eastern diplomacy and security, the politics of human rights and non-government organizations or NGOs, and Israeli politics and arms control. He was awarded the very prestigious Israel Science Foundation grant, served as a team leader for the Israel at the Polls chapter on peace negotiations and Israel-American relations, and was a member of the advisory board of Israel Law Review. He's a member of the Israeli Council of Foreign Affairs. He's appointed to the Israeli Higher Education Council, the Committee on Public Policy, academic participant in the Interparliamentary Coalition for Combating Anti-Semitism, and a participating member in the Halifax International Society Forum since 2014. He has multiple publications, and his op-eds have been published in the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Haaretz, Jerusalem Post, and has appeared as a commentator on the BBC, CNN, MSNBC, Al Jazeera, and NPR. Gerald received his BA in Physics and International Relations from Cornell University and his Ph.D. in International Relations from Cornell in 1981. It is indeed a profound honor and privilege to have you with us, Gerald. First of all, Gerald, you've written an excellent monograph for the Bessa Center at which you outline a few critical steps that must be taken. And I'd like you to perhaps outline these steps to make sure that UNRWA and other NGOs are not complicit in using the humanitarian aid to help assist organizations such as Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and for acting as the PR spokespeople for such organizations.
Sarah, thank you. Thank you for that terrific introduction. I think we can summarize it. I'm old. I've done a lot of things, but it's good to see you. And it's the wonders of Zoom bring us together, not in Silver Spring this time, in Jerusalem. That's where I use this background. The issues are extremely important. And I have to say that what is now taking place with respect to UNRWA should have taken place 30, 40, 50 years ago, 60 years ago. but it's important to understand that the entire, what's called humanitarian framework, the foundation, which keeps the Palestinian, not just the Palestinian terror organizations, not just Hamas, it's not just Fatah, it's not the Palestinian, all the Islamic Jihad, it's not the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. I could use an hour just going through all the lists. The humanitarian aid. UNRWA gets over $1 billion US, not including emergency aid, which they're getting now. And there are 13, at least, UN organizations funneling money to Gaza, as you pointed out. And then there are dozens of non-governmental organizations. We classify the United Nations bodies as international organizations. But then you have groups like the Norwegian Refugee Council, and you have Oxfam, and you have Save the Children, and over in CARE, and there are dozens and more than that. There are some that are run by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. We should talk about that. Terror organizations that are getting money largely, and it's important to stress this, from governments. UNRWA gets money from governments. NGOs, non-governmental organizations, get money from governments. And it's a lot of money. And I started off, maybe I'll give you a little bit of a background as to how I got into this, because I did arms control, I did security, strategic issues for many years. I got my doctorate at Cornell. First, I did some physics, and then I did a combination of technology and strategy, and got my degree there, and did a postdoc on these issues at MIT with Harvard. And then I made Aliyah, and that was in 1982. And I taught these issues and did research in them, was part of the Israeli strategic community. But in that time period, as I was doing this and teaching and many students from the foreign ministry and other government ministries, I began to see this phenomenon of non-governmental organizations having a tremendous amount of political power. NGOs, and the one that we tend to, the ones that we tend to recall are like groups like Amnesty International, which was founded in the 1960s, and then came Human Rights Watch in the 1970s. And these were great organizations. And then there was Oxfam that after World War II, and then the CARE and all these other groups. They're supposed to be, first of all, non-governmental. And then we find that they get a lot of their money from governments. And the question is, what are the governments giving them money for? What's the process? And then gradually, and this is what made me look at this field and realize how important it was that it become a focus of research. I'll tell you a couple of stories of how this happened. Back when I was still doing strategic stuff and arms control, I was in Geneva. This was around the late 1990s. And I was there's a nuclear lab just outside in Geneva, outside of Geneva, on the French side of the border with Switzerland. But I also went to the United Nations compound, used to be the League of Nations, that's based in Geneva. It's a huge, huge area, beautifully manicured, massive building. And I went to a discussion of some kinds of weapon system. Later on, I went to another one just like this on landmines. I was invited as a technical expert. And I saw these organizations like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch that were handing out material, and dozens of Palestinian groups and some Israeli groups and European groups. They were handing out flyers and material. Those days they used paper. Later on, it got to be discs, and then, of course, it was online. And what you saw in there was allegations against Israel that were familiar with Israel was committing war crimes. Israel was killing Palestinian children. This was in the late 90s, around 2000, as this Oslo process was falling apart, particularly 2000, 2001, when we started to see the bus bombings and the terrorism. And then we had the Durban Conference. And that's a very important landmark in the history. Durban Conference, Durban, South Africa, allegedly to celebrate the release of Nelson Mandela, the end of apartheid. That conference in Durban, South Africa, at the end of August, early September 2001, the main focus was to bring together 5,000 delegates from 1,500 NGOs, non-governmental organizations, mostly funded by the European Union and the government of Canada and various other places and governments. And they were very proud of this. And what was the focus of this? Israel, this is new language in 2001, we're used to it now. Israel commits genocide. Israel is an apartheid state. Israel commits ethnic cleansing. Israel commits war crimes. 5,000 people in a stadium, 1,500 organizations, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty in the middle, at the center rather. And this is the agenda that they adopted, and the operative word on the strategy or the final declaration was Israel, the international isolation of Israel as an apartheid state. Well, that was 23 plus years ago, 22 plus years ago, in the 23rd year, 2001. And that's the agenda there. And that brought me into looking at NGOs. Hillel Neuer does an amazing job. So does Ann Bayevsky and others on UN bodies. Then you have other groups looking at textbooks. And in fact, seeing Marcus Sheff also at the hearings. Einat Wolf and Yishai wrote an amazing book called The War of Return on the whole UNRWA refugee scam. $1 billion here, $1 billion there. But NGOs are also an important part of the puzzle. They often work together. And I'll add how the UN and the NGOs are just a big mix later on. So the focus of all of this is you see that the NGOs have been leading Human Rights Watch and Amnesty because they're the largest. And I may take a whole 45 minutes just on a monologue, but I'll get a few more points in. Human Rights Watch has an annual budget of over $100 million a year. That buys a lot of propaganda. And for 20 plus years, mostly led by Ken Roth and some of the most virulent, blatant anti-Semites, people who hate Jews, and they're very obvious about it. Sarah Leah Winston runs her own organization now. Omar Shakir, who was hired around 2015 by Ken Roth, and a whole group of them. That's what the $100 million buys. Human Rights Watch, founded by a wonderful man named Robert Bernstein. NGOs are also easy takeover targets. We have the same story with Amnesty, founded in the late 60s. Also by someone who was involved in Jewish activities. And we have a similar story. They now have a budget of 320 million euros a year, add 10% roughly. That's much more than the Israeli Foreign Ministry or other, it's not more than the State Department, but you can buy a lot of propaganda for that amount and hate propaganda. And that's what they've been doing. So at that point, after the Durban conference, where you have all this concentration, that's where the poison started to come from. And they had a working, plan that after Durban, a strategy, I guess is the right term. Durban was in September, end of August, early September 2001. And then you see the Jenin massacre myth, which takes this package of isolating Israel, sanctions, bringing Israel to trial in international courts, all of that, led by non-governmental organizations, led by this massive structure. So that's how I want to start this. And just to jump to where we are now we have, if we look at the South African bogus, there's probably a better term than that, this whole attempt to use the International Court of Justice, which itself is a very problematic body. It's not really a court, doesn't do justice. None of these courts qualify. They're entirely, they just use the language. They walk the walk and talk the talk. Also massive amounts of money from governments. Accusing Israel of genocide. This is Holocaust inversion. And if you look at the quotations in the statements of South Africa, if you look at the people in the audience standing with the South Africans, the same NGOs, the same people that we saw back in Durban, South Africa in 2001. These are virulent contributors. They're enablers, is the paper that I wrote. They enable, just like UNRWA enables, these NGOs also enable the brutality that we saw, but not just on October 7th, but for the last 20 years. So that's the focus of these issues, in my view.
So, what sort of review and oversight do any of these quote unquote humanitarian NGOs have? Are they subjected to any oversight from anybody?
They have a pseudo type of oversight. They will all tell you, the ones that have American tax exemption or based in America, 501c3, they will tell you correctly that they have boards of governors, they submit files to the IRS, 501c3 status, some are 501c4 status. A lot of those large parts, but not the most critical part of their financial records, are publicly available. But that's it. There is no oversight whatsoever on what they do. This is the biggest industry. We're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry. We've just talked about Oxfam has over $500 million a year, 500, 600,000, 600 million a year. And the amount of oversight is non-existent. It's called the halo effect. So you'll listen to an American president, American Secretary of State, American members of Congress, European counterparts, Canada, Australia, Japan, all those countries, will talk about and emphasize how much they're helping, particularly, and this, by the way, it's clearly very much disproportionately weighted to help Palestinians. I mean, UNRWA is a unique organization for the Palestinians, nothing else like it to help one. Many of these NGOs also have unique or disproportionate, massively disproportionate focus on the Palestinians. Norwegian Refugee Council essentially is adopted, it's a government body, but they call themselves an NGO. They get money from Norway, from Britain, from the EU, and from other countries. I could go on. I will encourage people to look at NGO Monitors, ngo-monitor.org. We have about, I believe, 270 organizations that are listed. NGOs, not UN bodies. That's done very well by UN Watch and by FSCs and others. Just these non-governmental organizations. And we just do the ones that are the most visible, 250, almost all of which get their money from governments. So there's an absurdity in this. And it's completely incoherent, inconsistent, I guess, with what they claim to be non-governmental organizations. I just want to add it. I'll add it. I always do this, right? Because I've been doing this for 20 years. When most people think of a non-governmental organization, I've had hundreds of conversations every year, somebody who makes a lot of money or inherits a lot of money, Silicon Valley, wherever it is. And I hear that they're interested or they've given money to groups like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty or any of the others. Why? And I've had conversations with a number of these people. Because they do good things. Now, why do they do good things? What do you know about them? Well, these people, the heads of the organization, came to visit me, and they told me. So when you say, is anybody doing oversight and monitoring them, until NGO Monitor came along, that's the only reason I dropped whatever else I was doing and did this. In my view, there should be an NGO Monitor. We want it to be NGO Watch, like UN Watch. But that name was already copyrighted, so we had to, and not used. But so we became NGO Monitor. But there should be one, at least in every country, if not every state. All the tax exemptions. So they have oversight, fiscal oversight. Occasionally, the IRS or some other US government body will examine, sometimes when we provide the information, or other groups like FDD, the Foundation of Defense of Democracies, on terror links. They may look into that. And there are a number of Palestinian groups that appear to have terror links and need to be investigated. But other than that, they get a 5-star rating from GuideStar because their financial records are in good order. But if you look at what they're doing, It is poisonous. It's lethal. That's why I called the paper the enablers of Hamas terror.
Can you discuss in a little bit more detail the um, political advocacy of many of these organizations for Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad? How are they so effective, and how can pro-Israel organizations actually learn from them?
They're effective partly because there's no oversight, partly because we have this halo effect. These are good people. They're altruists. They're moral. They're ethical. They do international law, international humanitarian law, which means they make it up as they go along. And I ask I apologize to my colleagues who do that, but I think that it has, in fact, um, very little substance and a lot of propaganda. But look, I'm going to say this and I may regret it. Bill Ackman, who's a very active and has done a lot of good things, Bill Ackman in 2011 gave around 10 or 11 million dollars to Human Rights Watch. And we don't know why, but I know that he wasn't the only one. His name is out there, so I'm going to use that. They're very good at raising money. But again, the lack of oversight over them. They have so much money that they're able to set agendas. They're able to twist and turn everything. When Human Rights Watch tells the world, writes a report, and they've done dozens of, Israel is hugely disproportionate in their focus. Israel commits war crimes. Israel is genocidal. It commits apartheid. Ken Roth, who was the head of Human Rights Watch from 1993 until 2022, and largely manipulates the organization. These are all of his people. He's still running the show. He has some sort of outside adjunct professorship at Princeton, which it's not just a joke. It's really an outrage. He has no academic qualifications, but nobody looks, nobody examines. They don't get questioned. And they're using American-based organizations, but it's a much wider network. So I think the most important thing for not just the Jewish community, but for the Israel supporters is to recognize and learn the material. And that's why NGO Monitor is out there. And we got a website, NGO-Monitor. Though I don't even have it on this background. I should have. Okay, next time. .org. And you can easily look it up on any of the browsers. And we have an A to Z index of 270 organizations. We have every country that gives them money is listed there. We try to keep them all up to date. We've had some success with the United States government. USAID has stopped or not funded organizations. Every time there's a Democratic administration, they go off the ranch. Is that the right word still in the United States? And start funding all sorts of organizations without doing their due diligence. And then we write reports and we meet members of Congress, and not just Republicans. Many Democrats we have a good relationship with a number of Democrats who are not anti-Israel, anti-Zionist. And we don't argue, we present the information. Number one, the organizations really are anti-Semitic in a lot of what they do, and we bring many examples. Number two, they're not really non-governmental organizations. These organizations, many of them, are tied to the terror organizations. The United States is the best in monitoring and in responding. It still needs to do more. Of course, the US gives money to UNRWA and other UN bodies, and sometimes they give them to other organizations. But then you go to other countries, or Europe. The Europeans basically embrace this whole NGOs, what they call civil society, it's another name, is a religion, except that it's not an NGO and it's not a civil society. If the Norwegians and the Swedes and the Danes and the Belgians and Germans and they're 27 members of the European Union, and the British still give some money to the Norwegian Refugee Council, which is clearly a propaganda organization promoting the Palestinian cause. By knowing this information, we present it 2 members of Congress. You can, I think everybody, and again, that's why we set up the website. It's available. We had a major article in the Wall Street Journal on the NGOs. That is, I think it was yesterday. The non-governmental organ, my colleague Naftali Bailenson, who is the chief operating officer of NGO Monitor, wrote an article about the number of these, I use the quotation NGOs, that were cited in the South African claim submission to the International Court of Justice in The Hague in the last few weeks. Also a number of them, by the way, from UNRWA. Now, they just cut and paste because everybody thinks they're wonderful, honest organizations. But in fact, they make stuff up. They make up international law. They make up, and of course, Palestinians can never be responsible for war crimes, for crimes against humanity. Hamas is a genocidal charter. Not of interest. They're victims. And that's deeply embedded. One other important point, because you began with UNRWA, and UNRWA is definitely out on the agenda. UNRWA works very closely. This is the same network, exactly the same network, providing cover for Hamas. Money, World Vision, with a budget of about $3 billion a year. The Australian branch of World Vision, over a period of years, provided about $50 million in humanitarian aid to Gaza. The head of World Vision, Gaza, was arrested in 2016, then convicted for taking 50 million US dollars from Australia, I think, and funneling him into tunnels, funneling him into missiles, funneling him into the fishing fleet. It wasn't exactly a fishing fleet, if you know what they did with that money. Long trial, very detailed, convicted. And the Australian branch of World Vision said, oh, we didn't know it was, they didn't care. It's going into a terrorist entity. And then they say the Israeli courts violated the rights and all. They don't even know and care about what happened. I'll just add one other point. The NGO Monitor looked at their public financial statements. One that they filed in Australia, one that they filed in Israel, because they created a nonprofit branch in Israel, and one that they had internationally. 3 entirely different budgets or fake budgets for what they were doing in Gaza. So that's why it's important to know the details and then to confront and bring this information forward. And I think that's what needs to be done. This entire network, just as UNRWA is finally being confronted, the same thing has to be done with Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and all the organizations that are funded by Europeans that are connected or linked to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which was involved in October 7th and has held Israeli kidnapped victims. They have an NGO branch. That NGO branch, in theory, does moral human rights things and does humanitarian aid. Just a front for the PFLP, as the Israeli government has demonstrated.
So I know that the Israeli government recently has called for the resignation of Philippe Lazare as the UNRWA chief, and this is not unprecedented. I remember in 2021, there was a case of Pierre Krachenbull. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Could you speak about what happened a bit with Pierre Krachenbull?
Okay, again, I'm not the world's expert on on UNRWA.
All right, okay.
But it's part of the same network, and I will say that I very much admire the work of Helen Neuer and Ann Baevsky and others, and we work closely together.
Right.
Let's go back. We can go back 75 years or 74 years of UNRWA. UNRWA shouldn't exist, right? We'll start with that. UNRWA is not a refugee welfare organization. It's an entirely political organization to maintain the Palestinian claim that they are victims of Israeli aggression and everything worse.
Right.
There's no other place in the world that the UN has a refugee agency for one particular conflict, and they maintain the conflict. That's Einat Wilson, Yishai Schwartz's work, and it's called The War of Return, and I can't give them enough credit. If you don't have time to read the book, you can find my book review, and also a couple of Zooms that we did, podcasts we did with them, and it's great. In addition to the fact that they have no right to exist and that they're political, with a budget of $1 billion a year, they are incredibly corrupt. If you think they're doing wonderful things, you don't care or you don't look. They've covered it up. But over the years, the evidence has accumulated. There were a few brave individuals who called out UNRWA and got immediately fired. One in 2014 that talked about how UNRWA's facilities are used for terror, for rocket storage and rocket launch and other things, and immediately he was fired. Then later on, a few years after that, I think his replacement, I'm not 100% sure if he was, or there was somebody in between. He was the number 2, sorry. But you mentioned the case of Pierre Krenbühl, I think is how he pronounces his name. He's Swiss. The Swiss are up to their, not just their knees, up to their ears and beyond in organizations like UNRWA. Look, they have Geneva, they're UN, they're neutral, all that other stuff, but that's how their corruption works. They also give a lot of money to NGOs. Thankfully, there are few of them. We have to talk about some of the things that are being done, just like as UNRWA is being examined and frozen. Also, some NGOs are being frozen. We'll get to that in a minute. But I'm just going to call him Pierre K. Okay. There was a corruption scandal that he was involved in. There was a woman involved, a young woman, and travel and all sorts of expenses and other things, luxury stuff. This is for people who are supposed to be refugees that have nothing. He resigned. By the way, do you know what his next job is supposed to be?
Yeah, who is the director of the International Red Cross.
He's been nominated. I don't know if he's been approved yet. That's taxpayer money. Everybody's taxpayer money. That is absolutely absurd, isn't the right word for that. That's how the system works. The corruption is extremely, extremely deep. And almost nobody knows what goes on. And again, in this case, Hillel Neuer and others, I believe the Israeli government was also very instrumental in revealing some of these secrets. But we also have the case of now, I think, Mr. Lazzarini, who I believe is also Swiss, but I'm not 100% sure. And he was appointed to now has been running UNRWA. And that's his life's work. The amount of money that goes on is incredible there, that goes through there is incredible. And of course, we all see the results. I have never seen any kind of the type of investigation, the peeling off of all the layers that is going on now. And of course, today's hearing was important. And I think it's important to recognize the biggest obstacle, apart from this image of Palestinians as perpetual victims and the corruption, is the Israeli military establishment. When I did some work on UNRWA and the NGO, and they've also worked closely and they fund NGOs. A lot of that money goes to pay off some of the same NGOs, cooperative projects. UNICEF is the same, although not nearly as big or visible. And there's the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. There are 13 organizations. You can look at them on our website. And they all work with these NGOs. So the process, the examination of what they do with the money for the first time is taking place in Washington. And I think it needs to include also looking at the NGO network that is closely tied to them. I started to say the Israeli government is the biggest obstacle, and I've even heard it this week. So far from unnamed military officers. And I understand it's a habit. It's something that might have been real in the 60s and the 70s after the 67 war. Let's say that half of UNRWA's budget is actually spent on Palestinians for schools and other things. If the budget were to stop tomorrow, who would run the schools? Who would run the clinics? Who would do this and who would do that? That's an excuse that's, and again, Einat Wilf and Yishai Schwartz have done a brilliant job. They call it West-splaining. But the Israeli military establishment has totally habituated. They say, and I've had many conversations, if UNRWA's not out there, then we're going to have to pay for it from our budget. No. What we need to have now, UNRWA, UNICEF, OCHA, all the UN bodies, the World Health Organization, there's a whole big World Food Organ, all these things have to switch from humanitarian aid for victims to economic development. Palestinians want economic development with jobs, with industry, not underground in tunnels, not making bombs and weapons. Shimon Peres, the only thing, well, even that, I used to have what's the word I wanted, a polite smile when he would talk about turning Gaza into the Singapore or Hong Kong of the Middle East. At least start to make it Bangladesh or something that will function, people will have jobs and they'll be able to show gradually economic development and stop this absolute massive dependence on UN bodies and on the NGO world, because it's sort of 50-50. CARE and all those other groups and Oxfam and Save the Children, they're also knee-deep in Hamas propaganda, and as we saw in the case of World Vision, and perhaps others, in terrorism. So the
Right.
process here has to be moving away from Palestinian terror organizations with the goal of wiping Israel off the map. Underground and above the ground, it's all these humanitarian aid groups in the UN, so they don't even have to worry about money. And of course, then there's Qatar, but we'll put that off on the side. So the Israeli military needs, we call, change the gear or the switch,
Yeah.
and say, this is costing us lives and everything else. We cannot continue. And I really hope that the Israeli political establishment, I hope Benny Gantz and Gallant, the current defense minister, and the war cabinet and the decision makers, along with Netanyahu, understand and begin to implement that. No more UNRWA. Phase it out. No more World Vision. There is no more World Vision since the trial. The Australians have not resumed their funding. We hear about them maybe doing it, but it's a good thing they haven't. And all those groups, the Canadians now are giving money to World Vision. The Canadians have the same virtue signaling. We're going to embrace and love I have to tell you this story. The Canadians, after Biden, after the Germans, after others, the Canadians even. Justin Trudeau, not a great lover of Israel, not a deep thinker of strategy, froze money to UNRWA. And there was a huge outcry from the usual suspects in Canada. So they immediately said, we're going to give $30 million to NGOs. Well, what's the difference? It's virtue signaling, and that also is what has to be stopped, both to UN agencies and to the NGOs.
Right. I have so many questions. I'm just going to ask you two more, and then we're going to turn to the audience. A lot has to deal with this 75 years of this self-victimization, perpetuating the 1948 conflict and the right of return. How do we break that? How do we break that model? To me, after 75 years of brainwashing, you know, how how can we start again with this
I'm going to go
policy
back. I should pull off my shelf the War of Return,
war of
Einat
return?
Wilf and Yishai
Yes,
Schwartz,
he does shut.
because I think the West-splaining.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, I'm somewhat skeptical that we're going to be able, the United States will continue for very long the freeze on UNRWA funding, but at least phase it out. Okay, you need it for 6 more months because you need the clinics and the schools and all the other stuff. Okay. But then put a very firm date, and this is going to end, and Congress has to be very active in this. That's it. It's not just the corruption. It's not just the terror links. It's fueling the conflict. It's maintaining this myth of Palestinians as victims. It's everything we see. And as I've said, there are a number of the South African presentation, the complaints to the International Court of Justice, quoted UNRWA and other UN bodies as if they are sources of facts. So that whole edifice needs to be taken down as quickly as possible. And then the transition to, as I said, a functioning framework. It's important to constantly focus on this. And again, it's not just UNRWA. If you could take down UNRWA, you've done a lot. But I would also, and one of the things that NGO Monitor does is that we are in close touch with a number of members of Congress, Chris Smith and others. They hold hearings. They do other important activities that are and information to monitor and to push back on the funding, forcing USAID. USAID is best of all of them in the world, but USAID does not monitor sub contracting. So if they have a big contract for one organization, then that organization will often give subcontracts, and that's one of the things we monitor. So certainly I would encourage people to sign up for NGO Monitor's newsletter. That's always good. But also to be aware when there are hearings, we let people know. And I think they're doing a pretty good job. A number of members of Congress, more Republicans than Democrats, are aware and use the material that we do, just as on the UN side of things, the other organizations and individuals are very active on the UN. The UN
Gerald, I think you might have frozen. But while we're at it, I just would like to put in a word for at least calling your member of Congress and having them sponsor the UNRWA Accountability and Transparency Act. It's HR 1102 in the House. The lead sponsor was Chip Roy, and S431 in the Senate. The lead sponsor is Chairman James Risch. It does call for withholding U.S. funding unless the Department of State could certify that UNRWA staff and partners and funding are not specifically affiliated with terrorism. It is at least, and it is subject, that UNRWA is subject to comprehensive independent financial audits, not affiliated with any financial institutions complicit in money laundering or terror financing. So that's HR 1102 in the House, S431 in the Senate. A number that you could use to contact your members of Congress is 202-224-3121 for the Senate, 202-225-3121 for the House. And I'm wondering, what happened to Gerald? This is the miracle of telecommunications during this age. Gerald, I don't know if you're there, but if we lost his feed. Okay, there he is. Gerald, okay, okay. And let's see,
Okay, I
Gerald is
apologize. We
coming
just had a
back.
power failure. We
Oh
had a
my
power failure.
gosh.
So I'm using my
Okay,
phone. And I think what I'm
okay.
going to do is, if I can figure out how to do this, is to put up just my picture because I'm using a flashlight so you can see
I'm
me, but it's not
sorry.
working very
As long
well. Okay.
as it's not an
So
Azaka.
no. It's this. Yeah,
Okay,
I knew that that would be the first thing people would think that something happened. But
yeah.
okay, how do I
Okay,
do the
okay.
camera so I can do?
Uh, okay.
Okay,
Great.
now you get to look at
And
my pretty picture. This is taken, by
Excellent.
the way, in Geneva. Oh, no, it was taken in Israel. Sorry, different picture. Okay.
Okay. Anyway, so now I think it's time for Joseph to read some of the questions that have come in and maybe pose some of his own. Joseph, who's my colleague here at Met.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Gerald, for that really amazing presentation. So one of the questions we got in the chat has to do with South Africa. And they're asking what the benefit is of Israel to maintain diplomatic relationships with South Africa. And I want to actually add an additional question here, because, which I think is in the same vein, because clearly the United Nations is working against Israel. What is the benefit for Israel of staying in the United Nations?
Yes. Okay.
Look, this is also one of those things we could spend a whole separate seminar webinar on. And I think the work that you guys do, I meant to say this at the beginning, but it's been a pretty chaotic couple of hours for me, including the power failure, was the important work that you do. So each one of these issues are important. I'm going to just give you a very brief, what I think is the answer, and which I think is largely correct. Leaving, here we go, I got a little bit of light in here, thank you. Leaving an organization like the UN, where you're 1 out of 190, and getting back in is an extremely dangerous process. It's not going to, nobody's going to care that Israel leaves the UN. I'll say in parenthesis, there were a group of people got together in something called the Halifax Conference of Democracies Only. I used to participate in that often every year. And they do good. That's the idea, is to at least have a framework of only democracies. And you don't have all the Muslim Arab countries, which are not even close to democracy. You don't have China and Russia involved. That's very important. But leaving the UN, I agree with the Israeli government's position, and it's been this way for many years, that the costs would be greater than the benefits. It wouldn't really make a difference. On the contrary, I think that the anti-Israel crowd would stand up and clap. They'd be very happy for Israel to be outside of that framework and want to push us out. South Africa relations is sort of similar. As long as we can maintain relations, there's always hope for a better government. If you don't have relations and there's a better government, you got to reestablish them. It's complicated. Low-key relationships, saying what you think is important. There's obviously, oh, okay, we're getting a little late here. Sorry about this. Okay. They're slowly restoring some power. The relationships are hard to rekindle. There's a South African Jewish community. You don't want to leave them isolated. When I went to speak in South Africa, and I spoke to large crowds in Johannesburg, in Durban, and in Cape Town, and they're very committed. They're very strong Zionists. They're in a very difficult position. They can't take any of their resources out. If each person makes their own decisions, I'm not going to criticize them. So I think there are good reasons to maintain even the difficult type of relations that are there. I don't think we'd accomplish anything by breaking those relations.
Let me ask a follow-up to that question. What would the UN have to do? Or do you see some sort of red line where Israel would say, okay, we actually do have to leave the UN, it's gotten this bad? Or is there no real limit of UN bad behavior before Israel calls it quits?
Look, I can give you my opinion, but I don't think it's very, very important. I'm not a UN expert. Again, I think that having somebody like Hillel or Ann Bayevsky on would be a good thing. They're the people who follow this in great detail. And let's not fool ourselves. These require a great deal of knowledge, the intricacies. I have respect for the Israeli ambassador. May have lost me now. Can you hear me now? Yeah, sorry. I have a great deal of respect for the Israeli ambassadors in New York Geneva at the audience. I think they fight a very, very difficult fight, and all the staffs that go out there. And again, there is a value for a country where we're not 55 countries like the Arab and the Islamic Organization of Cooperation, OIC, Organization of Islamic Cooperation, or Iran and Algeria and Syria. We're one country. With great difficulty, Israel has been accepted, very gracious of the Europeans to allow us in, to the group of Western European and others, which is where the US is and Canada and others. So we're part of that group. And we can influence policies to a certain degree from there. So, and there are other benefits to which I won't go into, just because they'll take too much time and that you won't be able to really get too far with that. But I think that there is a value in maintaining a presence and speaking your mind. The Israeli ambassadors give excellent speeches, not just, we all remember, us old people remember Chaim Herzog ripping to shreds the 1975 resolution equating Zionists with racism. And I talked at the beginning about Durban. Durban was exactly a continuation of that infamous anti-Semitic Soviet-inspired resolution. There wasn't a Soviet Union in 2001 in Durban. It was the Islamic groups. It was the NGOs, Human Rights Watch, Ken Roth, Reed Brody, and others. So I think that you need to fight back, and you need to look beyond the immediate issues and see perhaps a possibility of going further.
Thank you. So our next question is about back to UNRWA. And
can we try to find NGO questions?
Yeah.
If you can find those, let's
do
those. Because I don't want to run out of time.
Of course. There are quite a few questions about the NGOs. So one of them has to do with B'Tselem breaking the silence in NGOs of that sort. They're getting a lot of their budget comes from abroad. And the question is, why has Israel not required more oversight for these organizations?
There's been some increased oversight. I helped write the legislation that was implemented in 2011, transparency. If you're an Israeli non-governmental organization, NGO, and you get most of your budget, over 50% from governments, almost always European governments, then you are a different category, and that information has to be provided and made public every quarter so that the public knows that they're getting not really an NGO. But B'Tselem and Breaking the Silence and Yesh Din, and there are about 25 of them, are not NGOs in any kind of moral or political sense. They are agents of the European governments that use those NGOs to isolate Israel, to promote policies which are basically hostile to Israel. Having an Israeli fig leaf do that makes it better. But if without that money, most people would never have heard of them. That's how they pay their staffs. That's how they travel all over the world. That gives them legitimacy. It's hard to go beyond that in terms of free speech and those types of democratic guarantees. I do think that the Israeli Attorney General that said that the Israeli Foreign Ministry was not allowed to criticize or to ask the foreign governments for explanations as to why they're funding these groups, I think that was a mistake. I don't think that was justified, that the Attorney General made that ruling. It's something that we're trying to deal with, because when a foreign government provides money, we no longer have an NGO situation. What you have is agents of a foreign government. So that I think needs to be emphasized. But you can't, these are Israelis, and on free speech grounds, you can't prevent them, even if their claims are false and they do a lot of damage. All we can do is shine a very strong spotlight on them, and particularly on the European sponsors. I will say, it's important for me to say this in a broader context. We just got some of our power back, so you're hearing some noises in the background. European governments that provide, in some cases, 90 or even 100% to some of these Israeli NGOs, and to the Palestinian counterparts, this is a package. The 1990s and early 2000s, European governments started to fund millions upon millions, over 100 million euros, dollars, 110, 120, to political NGOs. Again, these are not non-governmental if they're getting money from governments, but that's how it was portrayed. Well, they said if we're going to give money to Palestinian groups, we should also give them to Israeli groups. This goes back 20 plus years. Gradually, European governments are acting responsibly, partly because of political changes. The Swiss government cut off funding for 3 NGOs, some of the worst NGOs, terror-linked NGOs, a few months ago, after October 7th. The Germans froze funding. The Swedes are now investigating, and there are more that are doing that. I do believe that as they go through and look at the NGO budgets of the Palestinian organizations, they will also recognize, and this has sort of begun to happen, that there is no justification for funding also. On the contrary, it's counterproductive to fund Breaking the Silence and B'Tselem, which are really political action groups that are disguised as human rights organizations.
Okay, to stay on the topic of foreign funding of these kinds of NGOs, especially the ones based in Israel, like B'Tselem, like Breaking the Silence, what I'm wondering is there any sort of oversight from who the money is coming from? So, for example, I understand if it's a European government, however, could the money also be coming from private donors within the United States, within Europe? And is there any sort of filtering mechanism to make sure that it isn't coming from bad actors?
Israeli NGOs, that's the legislation that I mentioned, not just legislation, Israeli NGOs, it's quite, well, it's actually more transparent than exists in the United States. An Israeli NGO that's registered as a nonprofit and is able to pay salaries, because if you don't register, you can't pay salaries, can't get the tax deductions. An Israeli NGO has to file its financial forms, including its donors. If it's not a foreign government, then they just file the total. So yes, it's possible that some money, significant money from private donors can be funded, can be provided without knowing. If the Open Society Foundation, with not just if, when the Open Society Foundation, George Soros and now his son Alexander, give money to Israeli NGOs, that's part of their annual report, and you can see that on their IRS submissions, who they give to, because they get, if it's, I don't exactly know how it works, if you're giving, that's right, they give it to the American Friends of, they'll give it to New Israel Fund, and these New Israel Fund or some other organization which has tax exemption in the United States will then transfer it to the Israeli groups. So most of that is knowable, is something we can find out. There are rumors that maybe Qatar and other governments give to Israeli NGOs. I'd say that if they do that, if they'd be taking a huge risk, because if it's leaked, then they would be shut down because they'd be violating the law. And in fact, the officers, board members who knew about that would clearly be subject to legal action. So there is a pretty good, in terms of funding mechanism, in terms of the Israeli NGOs. They're also pass-throughs, but also they're pretty transparent with Israeli legislation. So in terms of Israeli organizations, it's clear. Palestinian groups, if Europeans fund them, European versions of transparency in most cases will provide that information. I'll just tell you that it's not really a Palestine. Well, I'll give you an example of something that's important to see, some exceptions. The Norwegian Refugee Council is a multi-million-dollar organization, very politically well-connected. They get a lot of money. They give money to a lot of Israeli and Palestinian NGOs, often to bring lawsuits in the Israeli courts that, for instance, claiming that land is that somebody has bought a plot of land or has built a house in an Israeli settlement, an Israeli town, usually on the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, is funded by is funded by a foreign government, for instance. And so that can be, sorry, the NRC will fund these NGOs to go to Israeli courts and bring lawsuits. And as we all know, the Israeli courts tend to be very sympathetic and open and have a wide space for any possible claim that a piece of land 40, 50, 100 years ago was used by, was plowed by, had some connection. Ownership is a problem in this area. So they will then rule that the Israeli building somebody's house will have to be taken down. That happened in a couple of small towns. I think in Ofra, in Eli, somebody had a house and they had to take off a quarter of the house, part of one of the rooms and bathrooms, because it was over that line that maybe a Palestinian at some point was able to convince a court. Okay, I'm going into too many details. These are funded by the Norwegian Refugee Council secret. The Norwegian Refugee Council gets a 2 or 3 million British pounds, I think it's pounds, a year from the British government, from the conservative British government. It's the Tory government, partly the work that NGO Monitor did, stop funding everything but that. That is top secret classified information. I think it's after 3 years of freedom of information requests. This is supposed to be appearing before a legal panel. The British government or the Foreign Office has done everything possible, probably some small part of the Foreign Office, to maintain this a secret. Who are they giving the money to? We know that most of that money goes to Israeli and Palestinian NGOs to use for these bogus lawsuits. The fact that they're clinging with their fingernails to the secrecy, and I won't even go into all these excuses that they're making, on the dangers that would result if, in fact, the recipients, the NGOs, were revealed to the public. And that's all just nonsense. Okay, that's a long answer, but it just shows you how important it is, the secrecy in which this whole world operates and the degree to which they cling to those secrets. Just a few weeks ago, Memory, some of you may be familiar with that organization, released there was a document dump that was related to some sort of United Arab Emirates about Qatari funding, and one of the documents talked about 3 million euros being transferred to Human Rights Watch, additional 3 million euros in 2018. They also have an offshore operation. They don't reveal all of their donors. They're not required to the IRS. And so our motto is follow the money. And the money in this whole NGO world can be often very murky and shows you the connections. So if the British Foreign Office is, with its fingernails, wanting to prevent not public knowledge of where the Norwegian Refugee Council is providing NGO funding to Israeli and Palestinian groups, and the fact that groups like Human Rights Watch get money apparently from Qatar, we know from corrupt Saudi billionaires is another example. The money is just critical. It's an industry, and it's very often a corrupt industry.
Thank you so much, Gerald. This has been really informative and enlightening. We've gotten lots and lots of questions about the 2 bills that we're working on to at least have some accountability on UNRWA. That's HR 1102, the UNRWA Accountability and Transparency Act in the House, and S 431 in the Senate. We thank you so much for your wealth and your breadth of knowledge. Please, I want people to go to NGO Monitor, and your website is ngo-monitor.org. Please help contribute to NGO Monitor. They're doing excellent work. And as you know, we also work incredibly hard. Not only do we have these excellent webinars every week, but we're on Capitol Hill several times a week, meeting with members of Congress and trying to inform them and helping them to do the right thing with the help of excellent organizations such as NGO Monitor and the excellent research that they do. You mentioned this book that I have read, The War of Return, which is amazing, by Adi Schwartz and Anat Wealth. And I Highly, highly recommended. Really? Okay. Thank you so much, Gerald. This was really a pleasure.
Okay, it's my pleasure. And keep up doing all the good work that you're doing. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank